I want to talk about hand traps and board breakers in regards to the format. Now, obviously, we're not going to rate these cards only on how good they are against you, Belle. You also got to factor in other decks like Tenpai, Ritual Beast, Snake Eye variations, mainly Fire King. Memento is a relevant deck in the format, I think. Runic variations, Kashtira. There's a lot of other decks that you need to take into account when you are looking at how good are breakers, how good are hand traps right now, and which ones do I want to play. You, Belle, is the first and most important one, but we are going to keep these other decks in mind when rating these kind of cards. So let us begin with hand traps, and then let's move on to like board breakers overall. It's not just board breakers, it's also like in general like non-engine. Like I included like Crossout and Called By and Cosmic, which are technically not board breakers, but they're like tech cards rather. And I also want to emphasize that this is just my first impression. We've spent some hours today theorizing some of these hand traps into like the Yubel deck and so on and so forth, but mostly I am basing this entire thing off of theory and my first impression of how good these cards are against certain decks and like how well they cover different matchups. So let's go through this. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, in my opinion, is a strong hand trap. The thing with every single hand trap in this list is going to be, well, if you're playing against you, Belle, and you're using one of these hand traps, you're gonna have to hope that they don't have the right extender. This is true for all of these hand traps except for Shifter. Ash Blossom, I think, overall is a card that is relatively strong against you, Belle, if you use it in the right spots. I think it is solid on Samsara D Lotus. I think it is solid on Requiem effect to summon Fiendsmith. Those are, I think, the two main ones where you would want to Ash. And if they don't have the right extenders for that situation, then the card is pretty strong. I think the main selling point of Ash Blossom is that it is usable in a lot of different matchups. Like even in the Fire King matchups, it's solid. Against Tenpai, it's a solid card. Against Ritual Beast, you can probably also Ash in some spots when they try to Lara summon from deck. So Ash Blossom is pretty strong. Also considering that Snake Eye in general is less popular, so Hita is less of a concern. In general, really good card. Infinite Impermanence might even be better than Ash Blossom overall. In some matchups, it definitely is. In other matchups and situations, it's not. Like against Tenpai, for example, I'd rather have an Ash than an Imperm. Against you, Belle, it's a little debatable, but it's harder to play around Imperm because it doesn't get negated by Phantom. It doesn't play into Called by the Grave. It doesn't play into Talents. I think Infinite Impermanence is a really, really strong hand trap. And I think between Ash and Imperm, those are the two best generic hand traps. That's why I wanted to start with these. Effect Veiler, honestly, you might not think that Effect Veiler is much weaker than Imperm, but I think it is much weaker than Imperm in this format for a couple of different reasons. If you have Imperm against the Yubel deck, you can basically hold your Imperm for whichever choke point you want because they can't make a Phantom to just negate it, right? With Veiler, you are forced to use it early. Imperm can be a good card if you draw it as card number 6. Veiler is also even worse into Tenpai because against Tenpai, at least you can keep your Imperm against the battle phase if they have the field spell, which is less likely now because it's at 1. But Veiler is a lot weaker than Imperm. That being said, it still is among the best hand traps in the format simply because there's a limit to how many Imperms you can play. And Effect Veiler is, in terms of effect negation, the next best thing. And it is relatively generic. It is good in most matchups. However, there's also another argument, which is that a lot of the decks in the format, like Tenpai and Ritual Beast, also play Shifter, which makes the Effect Veiler completely unusable. It's definitely a fine hand trap, but it is a lot worse than Infinite Impermanence. Droll and Lockbird, in my opinion, is a card that I understand why people are maining it, but it basically does a very similar thing to what it has been doing in past formats. You're gambling a little bit. You're hoping that your opponent has one of those hands that's just really weak into it. Because if you are playing against Yubel, for example, which is the most important deck, there's a huge difference between your opponent starting with Fiendsmith Engraver, where Droll is insane, or they just start with Samsara D Lotus. If they don't open Lotus and they have to start by searching some stuff, then Droll is pretty strong. There's two arguments against Droll, outside of the fact that it can sometimes be hit or miss. It's one of the worst hand traps to draw into in grind games, and it is also kind of awkward to pair it with some other cards in the format that I think are really strong. For example, Purulia. And Purulia is a card, I mean, spoilers, we're going to put it into this category. It's a very strong card in the side deck because it's very good against Belle. So if you're main decking Droll and Lockbird, you're setting yourself up for an awkward position after you want to kind of side Purulia. That can be annoying, but there can be a lot of scenarios where you still want to play Droll. Maybe you think like, oh, I can just play Droll and Purulia, and if I draw one of them, I'm happy. So I want to play both. It can also just be a matter of, hey, I don't have Purulias. I want to use my side deck slots for other things. I'm just going to use Droll in the main deck and be fine. No counter synergy. Droll is hit or miss. Nibiru is another card that you might expect like, oh, Appaloosa is banned. It's going to go here, right? Not really. Because unfortunately, most decks in the format still have a really good way to play around Nibiru. That being said, I think the card is good in your main deck if you can pair it with another hand trap, realistically. It does suck against Tenpai. It is pretty good against Ritual Beast. Overall, relatively strong against Snake Eye, but generally, if you are playing a hand trap deck and you are already playing a bunch of these other hand traps like Imperm, Ash, Valor, if you can realistically pair your Nibiru, it's going to be a pretty good card. I'll say it this way, if I only had room for very little hand traps, I would probably start by playing like Imperm, Ash, or Droll, because those have a higher chance of being enough on their own. Whereas Nibiru is a card that needs to be paired most of the time. I'm a fan of Bystials. I think they're good. I think they are in a good position, and I'm gonna put them in strong in the main deck. The thing is, with Bystials, you're gonna really need to understand how to use them and what kind of other cards to use them with. Because here's the thing, Bystials are risky. Because Bystials are not good into every single deck. They are not great into Tenpai. I also don't think they are good into Ritual Beast, but they are pretty nice against everything that plays Fiendsmith. Although with the caveat that even against Fiendsmith, you kind of need to pair them. If you only have a Bystial against Belle, you're not going to have a great time. The cool thing about Bystials that I wanted to mention is that they also pair well with Boardbreakers though, because they give you more bodies and more pressure, which usually pairs really well with cards like Dark Ruler or whatever, because they can also be very efficient at stopping something like a Desiree, right? Like Desiree is the only card in the Belle deck that can negate Dark Ruler. If you're playing Bystials, you can just try to focus them around hitting the Fiendsmith cards out of their graveyard, and then you don't really care what else they make as long as you play Boardbreakers and Bystials and you pair them together. They're really nice. I think in that regard, overall, they are strong cards. If you're playing a deck that has room for very little non-engine, I wouldn't play only Bystials and nothing else. I don't think they work in that kind of way. Ghost Ogre is a card that I like, actually. Feels a little underexplored to me. I don't think it's insane, but it has a lot of good choke points. I feel like Ghost Ogre is a card that is similar to Effect Veiler / Nibiru, where it is at its best when you can pair it with other hand traps. It's not bad against Tenpai, right? Like you can Ogre the field spell when they try to search with it. You can even Ogre stuff on your turn if you draw into it, right? There's applications for Ogre in most matchups. I'm not sure if there's a great application against Ritual Beast. You can hit Ritual Beast Inheritance. Outside of that, I am not aware. Maybe there is a good choke point against Ritual Beast. I'd have to look into it. I honestly don't love Mourner right now. I feel like Mourner was so much better when the main thing in the format was Snake Eye, where you could always reliably counter the Belle Star with it. In this current format against Belle, I don't like it. Look, it's a worse Effect Veiler, way more situational. The most important cards you want to hit in the Belle deck are the normal summons, I feel like. So Mourner feels very mediocre. It's not the greatest card against most other decks either. I do not like Mourner right now. Meister, I don't even know why I kept it in. I can't think of great uses against it into most matchups. Probably not great. You'll notice that I'm not really putting many cards into the side deck category because I'm gonna be honest with you, most of these hand traps are just generically solid right now. There's not many hand traps that you can only side deck. Like Purulia, for example, and Phantazmay are two cards that you can side deck and they are solid in your side deck. You could even make an argument for main decking Phantazmay. It's possible. It's not great into all the matchups, but into Belle, Phantazmay is pretty nice. Other than that, most of these hand traps are useful in most matchups, so you could just main deck them. You don't have to side deck them. But obviously, everything that is strong in the main deck, if you don't have room in your main deck, it can also go in your side deck. Ghost Belle. Is Ghost Belle even okay? I'm not sure. My problem with Ghost Belle, whatever I hit with it feels like it's not enough. Before I would play Ghost Belle, I would play all of these up here. And at that point, I don't think I'm gonna have room for more. So I don't think Ghost Belle is the one. I don't find DD Crow bad when I'm thinking about it. Like, it has applications, similar to how Bystials have applications, but it, like, applies a lot less pressure. I wouldn't, like, completely hate it if someone was playing DD Crow. At the same time, I don't feel like I would ever play it over other hand traps, which maybe it makes it overall just, like, meh. It's not a bad card. I don't feel like I'm doing it justice by saying it's meh. But I just feel like you just don't play it because the other cards just do a better job. So why play DD Crow when it's just, like, average? We don't have to talk about it. Shifter is the best hand trap in the format. If your deck can play it, you should absolutely run it. It goes without saying, but Shifter is obviously not great into other Shifter decks. Yeah, I know, shocker. You're still gonna main deck it if you can, because it is the only hand trap that realistically stops the entire turn of a deck like Belle, Snake Eye, or Memento. I want to talk about maybe a little bit about the position of board breakers in general versus hand traps. And my first impression is that I do not love board breakers in this format, but I think for some decks, it is the most realistic and only approach. The caveat with hand traps, you need to be able to play a lot of them, because if you are not able to play a lot of them, you are not going to see enough for them to be useful, because most of them need to be paired. It is only very rare that against Belle or Snake Eye specifically, just one hand trap is going to be enough. The minimum, I would say, is probably 12. If you can't play 12 or ideally 15 or more hand traps, they're simply going to be alone too often. You're going to draw one hand trap and it's not going to do enough most of the time. In those kind of scenarios, if your deck has like 9 non-engine slots or 12 non-engine slots, I think you're better off to play board breakers, even though, and here's the unfortunate news for board breaker enjoyers, I don't think one board breaker is ever enough against Belle, because even the ones that I'm going to put in strong in main alone are not going to do it. For example, Dark Ruler No More, which is probably the most obvious one against Belle, because Belle has crazy endboards with Omni Negate, so naturally you would want to have Dark Ruler. The problem is the Belle deck ends on Varudras, Desiree, the Unchained Trap face down, whichever one you choose to go for, and like a Phantom of Belle at the very minimum. So what happens if you Dark Ruler is they chain a trap to it, the Unchained Trap that they will always have, and then they can chain Desiree to that and turn off the Dark Ruler. Even after you Dark Ruler, you are still facing down or staring down a Soul of Rage, a Varudras, a Phantom of Belle, maybe a High King Caesar, plus the hand traps that they open. Even arguably the most powerful board breaker in Dark Ruler will not do it. That being said, your main goal when you're playing a board breaker approach is going to be to draw very strong engine hands and pair it with ideally 2 board breakers. And in any sort of combination, that's where we're going to evaluate those cards. And Dark Ruler is one of the best ones to draw in multiple. And I'm gonna be honest with you, most of the other cards here are not as interesting against the deck that makes 2 Omni Negate. The unfortunate situation is that most board breakers are simply here to force those negates, and that's it. And then you move on. That is something that, for example, Duster does. If they end on Desiree with an Equip spell, you activate Duster, forces them to negate it, right? You're trading 1 for 1 with a negate, which isn't spectacular, but it kind of works. The same is true for Lightning Storm. The same is true for Darkhole and Raigeki. The cool thing about Darkhole, Raigeki, Lightning Storm is that if you can actually use them as your second board breaker, the one that actually goes through, then they kind of go hard. Being able to just Raigeki the board, even if it's your 3rd or 4th card that you use, at least it's gone. Obviously, the downside of all of these cards is that they are completely useless going first. That is a downside you have to keep in mind. If your deck wants to go first, you obviously want to go and look into cards like Droplets, which we'll talk about in a second. Unfortunately, my Runic heart hurts when I have to tell you that Cosmic Cyclone is a really good side deck card in this format, because Runic Sun is a real deck, Fire King Snake Eye is a real deck, other Runic variations are good. You can side it going first in a lot of matchups. Like, it's actually solid going first into Belle, it's solid into Tenpai. I would tell you that this card is main deckable, but I do think that in most matchups, going second, it doesn't do enough into Ritual Beast, I think, and it's also not good enough into Belle going second. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend recommend main decking it, although I think it's worth mentioning that you could think about that. It's not impossible. Take spells. I forgot to put Snatch Steal, but I guess Change of Heart and Mind Control will do. They fall into the exact same category of what I mentioned earlier, that they are terrible going first. Going second, they basically don't do anything other than force a negate, which puts them at the very bottom of okay. I think there is better options. Honestly, if anything, the Appaloosa ban kind of hurt those cards. Super Poly is meh. You can probably find good spots against Fire King. Maybe it's okay to side it, but like it takes extra deck space. It's not good against the best deck in the format. It's all right against Tenpai if they don't just like Lightning Storm or Duster it, but I don't love Super Poly right now. It's like somewhere here. Crossout Designator is a card that I personally think is very strong in the side deck if you're playing a hand trap combo deck at the moment. I don't think main decking Crossout is going to be a very common thing, simply because you do have to think about the fact that you are going second half of the time, usually in game one, and that card will not help you break any part of the yugioh board. Like, this card is useless against any combo deck going second. It's only good if you already have the hand traps with it, and then you use it to play through your opponent's hand traps, which is unlikely. I don't love Crossout in the main deck, but it is a pretty good card for siding for going first if you play against hand trap mirror match. Called by the Grave, I think, is going to be one of the most side decked cards in most combo decks, simply because there are shifter decks in the format, and this is basically the only out to shifter we have. Yes, you can hit Phantom of Belle. Yes, you can hit Promethean Princess. Yes, you can hit Garunix. It's honestly probably okay to main deck it, but at the very minimum, it's going to be strong to side deck. Droplet, in my opinion, is probably the best Boardbreaker to main deck, but it's not going to be the only one. Basically, I think it's very clear. If you have room for like 9 Boardbreakers, I think it's always going to be Droplet, Dark Ruler, plus one other one in the main deck. Droplet and Dark Ruler are the golden standard for Boardbreakers right now. Droplet specifically is phenomenal because it's also useful when you go first. So I really like Forbidden Droplet. Book of Eclipse, I think, is gonna dominate the second category for me. I think it's gonna be the best one out of those. I really like Book of Eclipse, actually. It basically does what I said about these cards earlier. Like, it forces the Omni Negates every single time, but it is also useful when you go first because you can set it as a disruption. You can even use it in some cases to play around like Imperm or Veiler if you want to. And then sometimes going second, if you can actually resolve it, you can turn off a lot of their things. The only downside is that it's ashable and it's hard to use it after you start playing, right? Because then you would be booking your own things. So you basically have to use it before you start playing. Enemy is meh. Evenly is, in my opinion, strong against some decks, but not great into yugioh, because against yugioh, wasting your battle phase just to trade with an Omni Negate is not good. The only way you can really pop off with Evenly is basically if you have 3 Boardbreakers. Activate a Boardbreaker, they negate it. Then you activate like Talons, they negate that. Then you go battle phase, you resolve Evenly, and they will still keep a disruption after this. You have used 3 cards, you've lost your battle phase, they still have a disruption on the board, and they will have hand traps in hand. It's rough, but there are matchups where it's a lot better. Like, it's really good against stun decks. I can see it being pretty good against Fire King, depending on what kind of opening they go for. I think it's a side deck option. I wouldn't main deck it. Fenrir as like a placeholder for like the whole Kashtira package. I think Fenrir just doesn't do enough going second, but it still is okay to play it because it is pretty good going first, and it doesn't do nothing going second. It is a push that's relatively easy to deal with, but they do have to deal with it. And if you pair it with 1 or 2 good other cards and strong engine hands, it can help, so I don't hate it. Tributing your opponent's stuff, in my opinion, is good this format. The problem is, not many decks can do that. So I'm gonna put Sphere Mode at strong and Lava Golem at like, okay, with the caveat that like your deck needs to be good with it. But it is one of the few cards, or maybe even the only one, that can be enough on its own. If you Sphere Mode the Desiree, the Varudras, and the Caesar, you can start cooking. Labyrinth, for example, is a deck that can do that. But you will know this best yourself, right? You will know when you're watching this video, you're like, okay, my deck needs its normal summon or it can't play, or my deck can afford to use Sphere Mode, right? So like, I'm leaving this one to you, but Sphere Mode is a very, very impactful card. It doesn't solve every single interaction, but it solves the most broken stuff. Pankratops I think is okay to side deck if you are afraid of certain floodgates. The problem is that in certain matchups, it doesn't do that much. One of the main cool things you can do with Pankratops is you can summon it, you can attack something, and then pop something else, so you can kind of like 2-for-1. Against yugioh, you can't do that because Nightmare Pain forces you to attack the yugioh monsters, so you can't really threaten anything with Pankratops. And you're not even trading with the Omni Negate. You can try to pop the Caesar, and your opponent just goes, well, I'll Phantom Negate it. And so that didn't work. And they will always have Phantom. Ultimate Slayer is another one of those cards that I think is very, very strong if you can play it. It's another angle that is similar to Sphere Mode. This card does a lot into the yugioh board. There is not many board breakers that trade 2-for-1. Ultimate Slayer does. You send Entis to target the Phantom of yugioh, to shuffle it back into the deck. And then the Entis is going to try to pop the Varudras or the Caesar, whichever one you find more annoying. Or you could also pop the Sequence that is equipped to Desiree, so that that also loses its negate. They can do the Dark Ruler trick where they chain a trap and then chain Desiree to negate it, because you're sending Entis for cost. You're still trading 2-for-1. So Ultimate Slayer is really good if your deck can facilitate it. If your deck can use it, you really want it because it pairs really well with other non-engine. Like an Ultimate Slayer plus Dark Ruler, Ultimate Slayer plus Droplet, Ultimate Slayer plus Talents, Ultimate Slayer plus Eclipse. Those kind of situations are really, really good. I do really like Ultimate Slayer if your deck can play it. And then Triple Tactics Talents, I still find it strong in the main deck, even though, once again, like all of these other board breakers, for every single one, except for Sphere Mode, it was the same situation. You have to draw multiples. But Talents is one of the best ones still. It has uses going first if you get Hand Trap, and it basically pairs with every other board breaker. The only downside to Talents is that it cannot be the first one you use, right? Like with Dark Ruler or Droplet or Slayer, you can start by using them. Talents, you have to wait until your opponent does something. So if Talents is your only breaker, or like you just have to start playing and wait for Talents to be live, it can be annoying. But like I said, you need to pair most of these anyways, so it's fine. I think Thrust is a little less powerful than Talents overall because it is harder to make Thrust work when you go first, right? Obviously, you can Thrust after getting Hand Trap, but you need to play a trap for that. So if you are willing to play a trap to make Thrust good going first, then you can use it in the main deck. If not, it's probably an okay side deck card. Obviously, Thrust is a really good board breaker to pair because you can just find whichever one the best combination is. And here's another card that is situational depending on what deck you play, but if you play the right deck for it, I actually find it very, very interesting. You're gonna have to look into on whether it's good in your deck or not, but Metaltronus is another one of those in this category. It goes into the strong category because it is a quick play spell that you can use going first and second. The main applications that I have seen for this card for the Fiendsmith mirror match, quote unquote, right? Like if your opponent ends on a wave hiking Caesar, that's a Fiend with 2800 attack. What you can do is you can Metaltronus it and summon out Desiree, which is a light Fiend, which can then bridge into your own Fiendsmith card. So with one Metaltronus, you have not only negated the Caesar, which is a huge problem for most decks, but you also have gotten yourself your own light Fiend, which is nice. Other things you can do with this card, you can do Unchained Soul of Rage into your own Fiendsmith Engraver. Basically, another one of those cards similar to Ultimate Slayer that can give you a +1 because you stop one of their cards and you get a body for yourself. So Metaltronus is a nice card that you can look into if you are playing a Fiendsmith deck yourself. Overall, I think board breakers are in a weird spot right now, but honestly, so are hand traps. Here's the thing, beating the yugioh deck going second is very hard, no matter what you do. So whether you're deciding to play hand traps or whether you're deciding board breakers, just know that everyone is struggling the same way. That is just something that you need to keep in mind. It is simply not always possible to solve every single problem in a format. Sometimes you just got to go with your best bet. You know, you got to hope that like you don't go second against Belle too often in a tournament, because if you're really trying to build a deck that beats Belle going second, it's not going to work every single time. Yeah, I hope this gives you a little bit of an insight of what I think on certain non-engine in this format, whether it's hand traps or board breakers you're aiming to use. Maybe even a mix of things, you know, that's something you can maybe look for. Pairing cards like Droll with some board breakers, pairing Bystials with board breakers is something you can do. Just need to make sure that it makes sense. Another card that is great to pair with board breakers is Mulcharmy Purulia post side, because if you can draw 2 or 3 cards off of Purulia and maybe force your opponent into a weaker end board, all of a sudden your board breakers become a lot better. Same with Phantazmay. You can actually mix in this format potentially to find the right solution, because honestly, after droplets, Dark Ruler, and Talents, it does become very situational and kind of like depending on the deck. like what else you can even play with the board breakers, right? Like Ultimate Slayer, Metaltronus, and Sphere Mode don't work in every deck, and all the other ones down here have certain disadvantages that maybe you don't want to play them because of it. And for hand traps, it's the same thing, right? Imperm and Ash are really nice. Maybe you want to play Bystials, and then the other ones down here are okay to play, but maybe not ideal. If you've been watching this on YouTube, let me know if you found it helpful. I hope you did. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff to support the channel. Appreciate you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Peace.